Europe is at a turning point. The US is turning away from a security focus on Europe, meaning that Europe must do more for its own security. Germany's soon-to-be Chancellor Friedrich Merz summed up that realization in a TV debate.
For me, the absolute priority will be to strengthen Europe as quickly as possible, so that step by step we can achieve independence from the US. I never thought I would have to say something like this on a television program, but after Donald Trump's statements last week, it is clear that the Americans, at least this part of the Americans, this administration, are largely indifferent to the fate of Europe. I'm very curious to see how we are heading toward the NATO summit at the end of June, whether we will still be talking about NATO in its current form, or whether we will have to establish an independent European defense capability much more quickly. That is my absolute priority.
That was on a Sunday night, and the next day in a press conference, he warned it was, quote, 5 minutes to midnight for Europe. So how will Europe build up its defense capabilities, and what will it take to get there? It's what we're discussing today on News Desk. I'm Piresh Banerjee. And I'm Alex Forrest-Whiting. I'll be keeping a very close eye on the chat, so do please send us your questions and your comments. And we've already had quite a lot criticising Europe for taking the US for granted. So let me just read you some of those. Joseph Smith says, any country that expects the current US administration to come to their aid has not been listening. Nostalgie Coley says, do whatever, don't care, just don't ask US taxpayers to subsidise your lifestyles. Syke Machin says Europe needs to help themselves and not to depend from others like the US. They have to be more dominating in this arena of defence and security. No, they do not, says Annie Hills in capital letters. The world and his wife want peace on earth. Use your words and your brains and work it out. And EF says on Europe rearming, it needs to be done now, not tomorrow, now. 7 or 8% of GDP should go to defence. So that's just some of those comments that we've already had. Thank you very, very much for those. Do please keep them coming, and your questions as well, and we will put them to our experts a little bit later. Thanks, Alex, very much for that. It's time to introduce at least one of those experts here at the big table. Thomas Sparrow, welcome. Thomas Sparrow is DW's security correspondent. He was also a long-time political correspondent in Germany. So he's really placed at the intersection of politics and security and defense, and he can talk to us about the political context within which Germany needs to make these decisions, whether Germany will indeed be able to strengthen its defense as the Chancellor-to-be is promising, or at least wishing. You heard that soundbite there. That'll come up again. That's Thomas Sparrow. Thomas, welcome. Looking forward to talking to you. To Thomas's right, an old News Desk hand, Jared Reed, who will be providing us some context to do with the current thinking in Europe, and also giving us an idea of how we are in this situation and why Europe is realizing what it's realizing at this stage. Thanks for that, Jared. And we will also have Cherry Chan, another News Desk hand. She will be in the community chat, talking to you guys, curating your comments. But that is not the only thing you'll be doing, correct? Because you have a poll question as well.
Of course, we have a poll question for you, as usual. Today, we are asking what single thing would make Europe more secure? Of course, we know that there are many things that can make Europe more secure, but if you have to choose one single thing, we have 4 options for you. Creating a European army, building East nuclear deterrence, massive expansion of arms industry, or forming non-US alliances. So please do vote, and we will talk about the results later in the discussion.
And we will be discussing some of these things also in the upcoming discussion. All right, let's get started. Let's get underway. So there seems to be this realization in Europe that, OK, Europe needs to stand on its own 2 feet when it comes to defending the European continent. Jared Reed can help us understand why that realization is such an emergent one.
Yeah, well, this has been something that's sort of been talked about for some years now, on and off, right? Since Donald Trump's first term in office. And it was Angela Merkel back in 2017 who made headlines actually back then when she said something like it was time for Europe to take our fate into our own hands. And this came after what was a contentious G7 meeting in Italy that involved Donald Trump. And we're going to get to this photo in a second. I wasn't wasn't going to bring that up quite yet, but we can do this now. This came from a G7 meeting actually in Canada the next year. And I guess this kind of maybe cements a little bit what Angela Merkel was talking about when she said, we're going to take our fate. We should take our fate into our own hands. She wasn't speaking specifically about defence, but just this general sentiment that Europe needed to be less reliant on the US. And I think this kind of photo where everyone's standing around Donald Trump and he's like sort of sitting down obstinately and everyone's looking a bit frustrated, this kind of, I guess, sums up, this general sentiment as well.
Just that photo is so interesting because out of all the world leaders present over there, there is only one other that remains, and that is Emmanuel Macron, just to the right of Angela Merkel, who is still on the world stage. Everybody else has changed, except, of course, Donald Trump. Just wanted to sort of...
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. I hadn't thought of that.
You see
but you're
Macron
you can
just to the right of Angela Merkel.
Yeah.
Hidden by, I think, is that Jean-Claude Juncker? Or is that some other official? And it looks like Jean-Claude Juncker, but maybe...
And it's funny how Emmanuel Macron has been dealing with Donald Trump this week, so many years later. And this was a photo, of course, that sparked a million memes, very good ones. We won't go into that right now. But these concerns over European defence have really come to the forefront again this last week or two, and that's because of various statements over the war in Ukraine. From America that have sounded some alarm bells here. The Americans want Europe to shoulder peacekeeping duties in Ukraine, increase defence spending, and they've also been reluctant to criticise Russia over the war, and some other developments too that have worried people. Specifically, on Monday, the third anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the US twice sided with Russia on UN resolutions on the war in Ukraine, which really would have been unthinkable in the past, and just this general fear that Europe is being sidelined when it comes to any possible peace talks between the US and Russia, and that Ukraine is maybe vulnerable to US interests in this respect. Some people in the transatlantic community have said, well, Donald Trump's worldviews and his positions have been known for some time, as far back as his first term in office, so why is Europe so flustered and worried about it now? And I guess that's partly because of some statements that Donald Trump made in the last couple of days that have gone further than anyone really could have thought. And I'm going to bring up one of those statements that's quite well known from, I guess, a week ago. Just bear with me here. We can bring this up. This is a post on his Truth social network where he says, and if I can work out how to bring this up, I'm sorry, he's calling Volodymyr Zelenskyy a dictator without elections. Zelenskyy better move fast or he's not going to have a country left. Now, this whole statement generally just contains accusations against Ukraine that are essentially Russian talking points for a war that Russia started. And this particular outburst from Trump came after Zelenskyy said that Trump was living in a Russian disinformation space, and this must have really upset Donald Trump. So this is what came after that. Now, Europeans are pretty shocked about all this. They're pretty aghast. Adding to that, we heard from Pete Hegseth, who's the Defence Secretary now. He was saying that the US's priorities now sort of lie with Asia. Let's have a listen to what he had to say.
The U.S. is prioritizing deterring war with China in the Pacific, recognizing the reality of scarcity and making the resourcing trade-offs to ensure deterrence does not fail.
So that was Pete Hegseth there, and I guess Europeans maybe are starting to see the writing on the wall a little bit. Some are already responding. We heard from Germany's Chancellor-in-Waiting, Friedrich Merz, and also, too, some European leaders are starting to make firm commitments. Here's Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister.
But, Mr. Speaker, we must go further still. I've long argued that in the face of ongoing generational challenges, all European allies must step up and do more for our own defence. So, subject to economic and fiscal conditions and aligned with our strategic and operational needs, we will also set a clear ambition for defence spending to rise to 3% of GDP in the next Parliament.
Hear, hear. So that's the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer saying that their ambition, the UK's ambition, defence spending to 3% of GDP in the next Parliament. People are wondering, well, when are other European countries going to follow suit, and when might they do that?
Interestingly, Keir Starmer made that commitment just a day before he heads to Washington, D.C. I mean, he's headed there tomorrow, so maybe that pleases the Trump administration. But, you know, let's put that question that you asked, Jared, to Thomas, who's been sitting very patiently. Thanks for that. I know you have lots to say.
I do.
So Britain is committing to a 3%, to an increase still up to 3% of GDP on defence spending. Will Germany do something similar? Does Germany plan to do that?
Well, Germany does want to increase its defence spending. One thing on the UK, because what's interesting is not that they're intending to do so, but where they're planning to get the money from. They're going to slash international aid. Right. So that goes to the specific question of how you're going to, if you are going to increase defence spending, where are you going to get the money from? And in the case of Germany, what's now under discussion is trying to get another sort of extra bucket of money, and I put it that way in simple terms, from the budget, which would only be there for defence spending. The discussion is of including 200 billion euros, if I'm not mistaken. And part of the whole debate is also whether Germany needs to restructure its debt brake. Probably we're going to get into that in order to be able to have some money to increase its defence spending. I guess each country in Europe understood the message very clearly, that they have to take defence more into their own hands. But each country in Europe will have probably different ways of doing so.
And different problems, of course, they'll be facing in terms of their own parliament and whether they've got the backing to do that.
Yeah, just on the question of Germany, simply because Germany had this election, and what we heard from Friedrich Merz earlier is, I think, the clearest in years or decades that anybody, any leader in Germany or soon-to-be leader in Germany has spoken about defence. But, you know, you talk about 200 billion euros as a special fund for defence. In the lead-up to in the whole election campaign, in the lead-up to election day, there were all these concerns to do with housing, the scarcity of housing, high rent, less spending on social benefits, also old age pensions and retirement benefits. Those are all appear to be the main concerns that the German population had. How do you fit something like 200 billion euros into that? And what is the priority going to be for defence spending when all these problems are staring you in the face? And let's not forget the sluggish German economy, 2 years in recession in a row.
And that's exactly what now German politicians are trying to discuss, and how they're trying to find ways out of this, because it is clearly the case that Germany needs a lot of money for investment in schools, in housing, in infrastructure, in digitalisation, and I can keep going with that list. Yet at the same time, given current international circumstances, given the current international crisis that we're seeing, it is clear that Germany, as probably all other European countries, or at least most European countries, needs to spend more on defence. So that goes to the debate on how you do it, where you put the focus on. Whereas, for example, Friedrich Merz understood the message, and we heard him there saying it, that Germany needs to spend more on defence, and he would like to get that special fund. There are other parties that would be in favour of maybe changing Germany's debt structure, as long as that also includes funds for the infrastructure needs of the country when it comes to schools, housing, and so on. And that's going to be the challenge for the new German government, how to make sure that they do have the money on the one hand for all this defence spending, how on the other hand they can make sure that they can keep up with their pledges on social issues. And this goes a bit into sort of German coalition building, which is a rather complex topic. But very shortly, very succinctly, I can say this. The Social Democrats, which will be most likely part of the next government, not leading the next government, but as a sort of second...
The party of Olaf Scholz,
the party of Olaf Scholz.
Chancellor, yeah.
Centre-left.
Centre-left, exactly. So it probably will be a centre-left, centre-right coalition, what in the past was called a große Koalition, so a grand coalition. You can't call it anymore because...
It's not so grand anymore.
It's not so grand
anymore. It's not
anymore.
as big as it used to be. Yeah.
Mini grand coalition.
Mini grand coalition, yeah. The Social Democrats have a clear social focus. They want money for better salaries, for minimum wage, for housing, for infrastructure, for digitalisation. So they will try and get that somehow into the coalition agreement. And then you have Friedrich Merz and his Conservative bloc, who obviously understand that there are needs there as well, but who would also need to invest more in defence. And how you find that balance, how you find those two elements as part of that coalition agreement will be, in my view, probably the most important challenge that they will face in forming that new coalition.
Yeah. But particularly on this whole 200 billion euro special defence spending package, isn't it the case that Friedrich Merz wants to get this done before the term of the outgoing government expires, which is what, in the next couple of months?
That's one of the things that's under discussion, which is also a bit complicated because under the previous parliament, so the one that's still now there before the new one comes in, the parties that formed that parliament, that have a majority there, would, or even with the Greens and the Liberals, the Conservative Bloc and the Social Democrats, they would have a two-thirds majority to be able to change Germany's constitution because the debt brake is part of Germany's constitution. So in order to have those amendments and also to have special funds, you need a two-third majority. They wouldn't have that two-third majority in the new parliament because in the new parliament, you have the extremes, namely the far-right AfD and the left, Die Linke. They would have what in Germany is called a Sperrminorität. In other words, they have a minority with which they cannot necessarily propose legislation, but with which they can block changes from happening. Or they can't propose certain legislation, but they can't propose that amount of legislation without passing. So that's where the whole issue lies.
Yeah. And just with the debt brake, we always hear that term. Very succinctly explain what that is, because that's really hampered, well, certainly Olaf Scholz, the current Chancellor, hasn't it, with him trying to get things through?
That was something that was approved in Angela Merkel's first cabinet many years ago, and the idea back then was that Germany would only be allowed to borrow up to 0.35% of its GDP. Those who favour it, those who see that as a positive kind of thing, as a positive move, say that it essentially obliges the country to be fiscally responsible, and that is also a commitment to future generations, because by borrowing less, Germany would have to pay fewer interests, or less interest, and then next generations would have basically less to pay for. Those who are against it say that it's basically got two problems. The first one, that it doesn't allow Germany to react quickly when things change. And now you have a situation where things are changing very quickly, not only with the war in Ukraine, with a new US president,
right,
with other conflicts around the world. And second, that it doesn't allow Germany to have the money that it needs for infrastructure, schooling, housing, and so on. So this is something that really, really, really divides Germans, that really, really, really divides German parties, and that really, really divides also German economists. You go out and talk to people about the debt brake and you'll have 10 different views about it.
I'm sorry that we're going so deep. Apologies to you guys talking about German politics. But the reason we're doing it is basically if you don't discuss this, we can't discuss what Germany can eventually do. And this is the basis of it. So apologies if you went too deep, but there's other things coming up. Friedrich Merz has been really vocal, Thomas, about what he would like to see and what he thinks Germany needs. One of those things that he was talking about recently was about the option of nuclear weapons. Yes, soon-to-be German Chancellor talking about nuclear weapons. Maybe we can just bring up the quote that Friedrich Merz gave a German broadcaster. This is what he said to German broadcaster ZDF, and I read it out. We need to have discussions with both the British and the French and the two European nuclear powers about whether nuclear sharing or at least nuclear security from the UK and France could also apply to us. That's what Friedrich Merz said to the German broadcaster ZDF. We'll just leave that up on the thing for you to just absorb that a bit, and we'll continue talking with Thomas. Thomas, I do not remember a time that a German chancellor, a soon-to-be German chancellor, or anybody in a leadership position talked about acquiring nuclear capability, whether your own or somebody else. This is a landmark change, and there's already moves afoot to make this happen, right?
This is very big indeed, and just a bit of context to understand why he's actually saying this. This has to do with this idea that Germany and more broadly Europe have to become independent from the United States. For a very long time, actually since the Second World War, the development of German democracy and the development of German security have been linked very, very closely to the United States. There's a very big military presence of the United States here in Germany. So if Germany is going to be independent from the United States, it needs to look out for other partners within Europe, not only within the European Union. I'm mentioning Europe more broadly, to also help guarantee that security in an international order. And that's why Friedrich Merz is now saying, well, if we're no longer going to be looking at the United States to help us guarantee our security, then we have to do it ourselves. And that's why he's going to France and the UK.
Just a quick question, because Devos here is asking in the chat about a specific question. If does Germany have nukes? I mean, is Germany covered under the US nuclear umbrella? There are US troops on the ground here in Germany.
There are US troops here. There are several bases here as well. So obviously, from that perspective, Germany has seen for many decades that it is covered in terms of security by the United States. But obviously, given Germany's past, that is something very difficult, very controversial here in the country. And this is also part of the shift that we're seeing. If Germany is going to become more independent from the United States, and I say this carefully and I'll tell you why, then that's going to be done probably with other European countries, in particular France, which is a nuclear power, and obviously the UK. And why do I say this carefully? Because we've heard this in the past, that Europe needs to become more independent from the United States. Sure. Jared was saying that that was also something that was clearly visible during Donald Trump's first term. That's easier said than done. It's easy to say so. It's very difficult to actually achieve it.
Why? Because domestically there is no consensus, or because Europe doesn't have the resources?
A bit of both, but also because of the fact that we're talking here about something that involves a change of decades. I mean, this is part of Germany's democracy. This is part of Germany's development for decades. When the Second World War ended, there was this idea that the US would help to guarantee Europe's security.
Correct.
And if that's no longer the case, then that is something that will require really a lot of discussions at the European level.
I will just interrupt because we've had a lot of comments about Germany, and as Biresh just read out the question about nukes, nuclear, but also other questions about the situation in Germany and whether it will be able to do what it wants to do, given what we're talking about with the restrictions coming up. A lot of people asking that about, how is it going to be able to do these things, for example, with the AfD being such a massive factor within the upcoming parliament. We've kind of been talking about that, but I just want to mention it because there's a lot of interest in how it's going to change in Germany.
Shall I just briefly answer that?
Yeah, do,
because
please.
The AfD, as a fiscally conservative party, believes in the debt brake, so it doesn't want Germany to have more debt. Yeah. So that's one way in which the AfD will probably be in opposition to any idea to change the debt brake. That's one important element to understand, and the AfD got 20% of the vote on Sunday, doubling its result from 2021.
The second most popular party in Germany.
For the very first time, the second most popular party in parliament.
A far-right party for the first time, second most popular party.
Huge development here in the country. That's one thing. The second thing is what the question was, how is Germany going to manage this?
Yeah.
One part of the discussion is to reform the debt brake. For that, you need two-thirds majority. That is something that certain parties, for example, the Greens, even the Social Democrats, have been speaking about. The Conservative bloc, they're a bit more wary of actually reforming the debt brake. It was also something that was proposed and passed in the Conservative bloc under Angela Merkel. So one option would be reforming the debt brake. Another option would be making an exception to the debt brake, which is something that has been done in the past, because you can have an exception to the debt brake if, for example, there's an emergency or if you need it for something specific. So the discussion there is to have an exception for the debt brake in terms of security, only for defence.
Got it.
Where they could then have those 200 billion euros to spend only on defence.
OK.
Again, there are people who are in favour of that, who say, yes, that's absolutely the way forward. There are others who say, well, you can't just have one exception and then another exception and then another exception, because basically then you're saying that the debt brake is no longer effective.
You've been a political correspondent for so long, and whatever politics I have seen, you're, of course, more experienced than I am. Anytime anything enters Parliament and these discussions begin, things stall. And here Friedrich Merz wants to move at a relatively fast speed compared to German parliamentary speed. Do you think he's going to be able to do it? I mean, it's a really open-ended question, but I don't know. How do you want to answer that?
In the new parliament, which the idea for the new parliament is to begin at the end of March, that would be very difficult. Because, again, he would need a two-thirds majority, and the two parties that are on the extremes of the political spectrum, so Die Linke on the left and the AfD on the right, would not go with that reform for different reasons. So you wouldn't want, or they wouldn't want to have support from the AfD. They said they don't want it, so the AfD probably wouldn't vote on that. And on the other hand, Die Linke have said that they're not going to go with that idea unless there is a lot of money spent also on the issues that you mentioned earlier, on everything related to social aspects. And that's something that's probably not going to happen.
Just widening it out a bit, I mean, I know we're spending a bit of time on Germany, and I think it's important. It's the largest economy in Europe. How important is it for Germany to get its defense reforms right and on track for the rest of Europe?
Very important. We're talking here about, well, I wouldn't say now it's the most important country in the European Union, but definitely one of the most important countries in the bloc. And okay, defense is to a large extent something that is a matter for member states, not for the European Union. That's why, for example, and I know, Cherry, that you mentioned in the poll that idea of a European army. That's one of the reasons why the European army has not materialized, because defense is essentially something that nation states want to keep as their own responsibility and not something at a European Union level. So it's important for Germany to certainly have a bigger role when it comes to defense spending in Europe. And it can also obviously play a role in what kind of defense spending some of the neighboring countries have, because Germany has borders with 9 countries in Europe, 8 European Union countries plus Switzerland. So Germany is really at the heart of Europe. If Germany has a good defense policy, that is something that directly or indirectly is going to affect its neighboring countries as well.
Policy is one thing. What is the mood amongst the German population? Do they want to see their country rearm, given that we're talking about a country where you had where the armed forces were never held in such high esteem, particularly after in the period after the Second World War, and defense spending was always frowned upon. Something like conscription, for example, was suspended in 2011. Was it? I think 2011. Does the public accept this, that their leaders want to rearm and Germany, I don't know, increase the number of soldiers and stuff like that?
Again, in the political extremes, there's more skepticism than in the center of the political spectrum, and that has to do, again, with historical reasons, with political positions as well. I think there's an understanding among a majority of Germans that this is something that needs to happen. They probably understood that in the past, after the war in Ukraine began, where they understood, OK, it's time for Germany to actually step up its defense spending, essentially because the Bundeswehr, the German armed forces, was in a really, really, really bad state. It was a matter for, you would even make jokes on the state of the Bundeswehr here in Germany. So I think many understood, look, with a war actually hundreds, if not thousands of kilometers away from here, Germany needs to be prepared. So I think there's that understanding. And the second sort of eye-opening situation that happened was what Jared mentioned earlier. When you have someone like J.D. Vance, the US Vice President, come to Germany, to Munich in a security conference, criticize Europe so openly, when you have Donald Trump with the statements that you read, that is something that for many in this country is a sort of clear wow moment where they say, OK, it's time really for Germany to take things into their own hands.
Are these red lines that the Americans have crossed?
Well, they are red lines. Okay. You were asking also, Jared, earlier, or you were mentioning that that's something that not necessarily is new. I mean, that in the first Donald Trump presidency, you also repeatedly heard European leaders saying we have to take this into our own hands, we have to become more independent from the United States. What's changed is the context. Yeah. Maybe Donald Trump is the same, but what has changed is the political context. We're talking here about a war in Ukraine that's not far away from Germany's borders, that's not far away from European borders. You're having the European Union really help Ukraine in a very, very important way. I know, Sherry, that you've got some statistics on that. Germany is the second country that gives Ukraine more in terms of military support after the US. Outside of the EU, the UK also plays a very significant role there. So the whole discussion does really mean that I think many in the country, if not all, have understood that it's time for Germany to really increase its defense spending. Where I see some criticism, where I see some skepticism, is that it's done instead of some of the other developments, instead of the other investments that definitely need to be done.
Which is just what the UK is doing, as we've just said, having to pull money out of foreign aid to put more money into defence.
Yes, I'm not sure what the debate would be here in the country if that were the case, but I do think that the new government will have to, in some way or another, make sure that if they're spending more on defence, they also spend more on schools, infrastructure, and digitization.
Okay, and let me just read this from Nile Chatuverdi, who says exactly that. Either the German Chancellor doesn't push money into defence and endangers Germany, or he does pull money out of social services and lets the AfD or the far-left parties gather even more steam. Both outcomes bad, he says.
Yes,
so,
and that user has a point, because if voters see that in their towns or in their villages, the school is no longer in a good state, the hospital is no longer in a good state, that basically leaders here in Berlin are focusing more on buying weapons than in taking care of people's basic needs, then that is a situation where many voters do tend to go to the political extremes. So
this was also arguments we heard during this recent election campaign, right? Like from I guess particularly the AfD, but also some other minor parties, that more money was being spent overseas than fixing some of the problems that.
But there was a bit of fear mongering there as well.
That
some
is
parties
also
were saying that,
right.
well, that's what they're going to do. They're going to just take the money away from social benefits. You will get nothing. Old age pension is going to be gone. Your retirement pensions are going to go.
I mean, it's classic electioneering, but it still was something that we heard. Yeah,
it articulates a fear in the population,
and that's one of the reasons why a lot of people, surprisingly for many here in Germany, voted for the left party, because the left focused their campaign specifically on social matters.
Correct.
Yeah.
So social matters that for many are essential in their daily lives.
Okay. I'd like to expand this discussion a bit to the European level, but before we do that, let's just take a quick, I don't know, call it a break, call it a check-in, let's call it a check-in. We check in with Cherry, and Cherry can tell us the mood.
Check-in with Cherry.
Check-in with Cherry. We're going to call it that. That's going to be the name of the segment.
I just want to make a remark that the statistic that Thomas just mentioned, I put a link in the chat so anyone who wants to check this statistic can look at the link. But so about the chat, there are many people who actually agree or tend to think that Europe has to, if not spend more money on its own defense, but pay more attention. So they also think that the US are not being reliable anymore. We've seen comments, John Jacobs saying that why should Europe be a defense priority for the United States? A rhetorical question. Also, Snor Berry said all countries should adequately fund the defense of their own sovereignty. Not sure why people are freaking out, so that they obviously think that Europe should spend more on its own defense. But there's also this technical question that I've seen just now that I think is quite interesting. We talked a bit about the nukes, the nuclear option for Germany. Someone asked, but isn't Germany under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty? Can they acquire nukes? So maybe we can talk a bit about that, or...
Well, there's one comment that I actually do need to make with that rhetorical question that you mentioned. Why should the United States care about Europe's security? I understand maybe where that comment is coming from, because that's also, by the way, a comment that you often hear in the United States. I was a correspondent in the US beforehand, before Trump came to power, and that was something that also you would hear especially among some people in the Republican side of Congress. And I think the reasoning why is because the challenges that we're seeing now are not national challenges by definition. They're international challenges by definition. When you have something like what's happening now in Ukraine, where a country, Russia, invades another one, and by doing so also violates international law, then that's not something that is just for Russia or for Ukraine to deal with. It is something that affects every other country. Because if it happens in Ukraine and Russia, it can happen in Taiwan and China. It can happen in other parts of the world as well. So that's why there's an understanding that security challenges are very, very rarely national challenges, that they're in nearly every case international challenges, and that from that perspective, countries do need to work together, with a caveat. Because I do understand that maybe the United States, or the arguments that come from the United States saying that the US has paid too much money for European security, and that whereas the US has a lot in defense spending, some European countries have only now started to realize that they have to keep up that 2% of GDP spending. So that I do understand from a certain extent, but that rhetorical question is important because it comes a lot.
Yeah.
The answer is because security challenges are international, and it makes sense to deal with international security challenges from an international perspective.
Security problems don't respect borders.
I know you want to go move on, but just one
quick
comment from DeVos, who has said, as an American, I'm very sorry for the direction we're heading. Just know there are millions of people that disagree with this administration. And there was somebody else, actually, who then removed her comment in the chat I saw, but who said that she was actually in the process of rescinding her American citizenship because of some of these issues. So I thought that was quite an interesting point to throw in, given that the majority of the comments seem to be it's time for Europe to stand on its own 2 feet and you can't keep relying on the US.
I really just want to say I like this chat for this very reason. People just tell us what it is that they are dealing with. And it's just very good to hear comments like that. Not just that, but what about other comments? But it's very personal. I quite like hearing it personally. Anyhow, I promised that we wanted to sort of expand the discussion from Germany to a wider European thing, as Thomas was also saying. In the context that we find ourselves in now is an international security context, and we are trying to explain what might happen at the European level. We want to explore that. And to help us do that, waiting very patiently in the wings has been Maria Martisiute from the European Policy Center think tank in Brussels. Maria, am I pronouncing your last name correctly? You may admonish me if it's
you're
incorrect.
pronouncing it well.
Is it all right?
Martisiute, but it's absolutely fine how you say it.
Thank you so much for that. I just need to tell you guys, Maria recently co-authored a study. This was as recently as January this year, a study titled Quick March, 10 Steps for a European Defence Surge. It was Maria with some other co-authors from the European Policy Center. We'll paste that study in the community chat. You guys can follow it. It makes fascinating reading as to...
Michelle can bring it up, actually, if she wants to. I can show
there you
it
go.
quickly.
That's
there we go.
I mean, it delivers what it says on the tin. It tells you the 10 steps for a European defence surge. You can go through some very interesting facts over there. I wish we could just talk only about this document, Maria, but for the sake of brevity, can you, at the outset, tell us, from your studies and from your research, what are the main hurdles that you see at the European level to to Europe arming itself and strengthening defence? What are the main hurdles you see?
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. There's a whole lot of hurdles, and we are really in a very dire situation when it comes to European defence and security. In fact, we have been for a while, and that spans all levels, industrial level, financial level, societal level. It spans even our psychologies and mindset, because I would go as far as to suggest that Europe has been in undeclared war with Russia for quite some time, and that we see in Ukraine in terms of, cyber, but also kinetic warfare, but also due to hybrid attacks on EU and NATO, which in terms of, attacking our infrastructures, cyber attacks, GPS jamming and spoofing, and many others. So there's a lot of work that Europe needs to do at, multilateral level, institutional level, but also bilateral level. So first is the industrial. European industries are very fragmented. There are a couple of, so to say, national champions, but it's not an integrated ecosystem. So we really need to break the silos and bring the industry together with a view to integrating it into what I would call an innovative, competitive, forward-looking European defence technological and industrial base. Mm-hmm. Second, of course, is financial. I mean, as I followed your discussion, and, we are very much, have been relying very much on US support. And this is a historical legacy. So we have underinvested very heavily. According to Draghi report, we face 500 billion investment gap in defense over the next decade. Now, we cannot wait for the next decade. Actually, we need money now in view of the challenges that we're facing. And this fundamentally challenges our readiness We do have capabilities. European single market is, worth around 17 trillion of GDP and accounts for about 15% of global trade. We do have capabilities. We do have monies there. And we have to make very difficult decisions. Do we tax? Do we cut? Do we borrow? Do we have innovative instruments? Do we do a compilation of these things now, in the current financial perspective, in view of the challenges that we face, and not in a couple of years to come?
There is a
third one.
There is a lot that you brought up. I mean, let's just try and digest just these points, like 500 billion euro gap that needs to be invested and a problem of disintegrated industry. What I found interesting in the report, right at the outset, you say, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Europe has never been the last time Europe was this weak was in the 19th century. Although I'm saying it all wrong. Since the 19th century, Europe has never been so weak militarily. Is that fair to say? Is that what you're saying in the report?
It's not untrue. I mean, even in early 1990s, during the Gulf crisis, we had Belgian foreign minister very famously say that Europe and EU is an economic giant, but a military worm, and that has largely been left unchanged. Of course, we do have military capabilities, but they are nowhere near the kind of challenges we need to address. We are not prepared adequately, if I can be very, blunt and direct, in terms of our interests, in terms of our finances, but also civil preparedness. I heard you speak in the studio about, the narratives and perceptions in Germany. We are not engaging adequately with our societies about the kind of threats and risks we face. Because security and defense is an investment, not just in security, but it's an investment in jobs. It's an investment in growth, in boosting Europeans' economic potential too. So I think there's an important element of narrative that is missing too. But you're absolutely correct about our weakness, and this is one of the Trump's messages.
You just hit the nail on the head. You need to invest in defense, but as we were discussing with Thomas in the studio, the discussion, at least in Germany, is that investment in defense should not come at the cost of services to the public. How does one manage to do both at a European level? What did your research throw up?
You need to prioritize. And actually, you have to have priorities within priorities. But it starts with the very acknowledgement of how bad a situation is. And it is our responsibility at European, but also at national levels, including regional and local, to have those difficult, uncomfortable conversations with the society and with the citizens. Because the cost of unpreparedness, the cost of underinvestment will be even higher. And we know that cost. I mean, Eastern Europe in particular knows that cost. Germany knows that cost.
What is a good financial instrument or a financial way to be able to balance those priorities?
It's a combination. I don't think there is, one solution for all, given what high investment needs we have. I think it has to be a combination of cutting perhaps in certain sectors or rediverting financing, particularly those that have been, monies unspent in some of EU programs. They are underperforming, so money could be transferred. At the same time, borrowing. I mean, I think, and I've seen this in media in Germany, that it is really an emergency case in Europe. So we should not panic, we should not be alarmist, but we should be realistic and very calmly approach the fact and say that, just like we borrowed during COVID, perhaps this is a similar scenario we should consider now in the UK. May I just highlight that UK took almost a century to return its loan for the First World War. So we need to ask ourselves, do we want to bring a war for our future generations, which is not unrealistic? Or do we want to bring them, maybe some loans to return, but to prevent the war?
You're asking for a change in mindset. That is it's just a horror scenario for many Europeans.
Let me just bring it. There's so many comments. Hi, Maria. I'm Alex, and there are very many comments in our chat all about this whole issue of, if you're going to pay for this, what's going to suffer? What we've just been talking about. We have, for example, Camille. Actually, I'll come back to him in a moment, but Nile Chatuverdi says, question, simply who will pay for defence modernisation? There are only 3 countries in Europe who have the money, France, Germany, Britain. And do they? But all 3 governments are facing copious economic crises. So where will the money come from? And that is the big issue. Certainly, we were talking to Thomas about this earlier with the whole issue in Germany. We were also mentioning the UK. Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister there, having just said that the UK is going to increase its amount of GDP that it spends on defence to 2.5% by 2027 and 3% by 2033, but at a cost. And in the UK, it's foreign aid that's the cost. There has to be a cost, doesn't there? You're not just... I know you just talked about COVID, but that can't last forever. You can't just have this blanket bank to pay for these things. There is going to be a cost and somebody will have to pay.
You're absolutely correct. And it's a shared responsibility. And thank you for mentioning the very wealthy countries in Europe. But I would like to also recall that the Baltic states, for example, the Scandinavian countries, Poland, they're the pioneers right now, the champions of investing in defense, and they're leading NATO alliance. Poland is number 1, this year planning to reach 4.7% of GDP. Lithuania has, announced that in the next couple of years, they're planning to reach 5 or 6% of the GDP. Scandinavians are investing a lot in what they call comprehensive security. So not just the military defense, but civilian defense as well, with a view to, preparing also the private sector, trade unions, businesses and civil society at large to take part in this. And these are major contributors to European security as well, not least because they're on the front lines as well. But it is important to keep that in mind. So the costs have to be spread. Now, I'm not going to say, equally, unequally, but there has to be a shared understanding that we are in this together. So certain countries can indeed perhaps chip in more, while others a bit less. And, in proportion to the GDP. What I would like to bring in is that Commission President von der Leyen is indeed considering this exemption of 3% of a deficit ceiling at the level of the EU, which, for example, would help alleviate the pressure of many member states. Just to give you an example, in Poland case, in 2023, they have, had a deficit of about 5%, but 3.
Uh-oh, have we lost this line? Maria, can you hear us? Well, we appear to have lost that line. We'll try and work on it.
Thomas
and bring Maria
had something
back.
to say
Thomas,
because he was itching to say something.
I was raising my hand. No, I mean, I actually like the fact that Maria was mentioning other countries in the European Union, because the discussion does tend to focus on Germany, France, and then if you make it a bit more broader, in the United Kingdom. But it is the case that if you look, for example, at Poland, Poland plays a very significant role when it comes to defence in the European Union. That's one point that I would like to highlight. The second one is, she says, there needs to be an understanding that we are in this all together. I think there is already an understanding that we are in all this together. I think that the clear understanding happened already 3 years ago now with the start of the war in Ukraine, 2022, that it was not a challenge just for Poland or just for the Baltic states or just for Finland or just for Sweden, that it was something that very clearly was a matter for Germany, for France, even for countries in other parts of the European Union. And how they are together in all this is very simple. NATO. NATO. And we must not forget NATO as part of the discussion, because also the US...
We were not going to forget NATO as part of the discussion. I was waiting to bring it in. It is there in my notes. But you go on, yeah.
No, I'm just trying to say that it's important that we discuss also about NATO, because it is through NATO where maybe there will be a possibility to still have the United States on board.
And this is where I wanted to bring in Maria. And Maria is back. Maria, can you hear us? You just sort of disappeared, you sort of froze. And I was wondering if Europe needs an investment in digital infrastructure first before it decides to go to war. But you were giving an example of what European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has suggested. So please, if you'd like to finish that thought, and then we can move on to something else.
Indeed, one of the ways to alleviate and perhaps foster great investments in defence and in increasing defence spending is what von der Leyen currently is considering in terms of loosening a little bit the fiscal rules, and that are related with the 3% budgetary deficit ceiling. So if defence spending could be taken into account in that regard, that would help spread out a little bit the burden of cost sharing.
I do have a question here from Camille Oberil, who asked this: how do you achieve these common defence initiatives if we as European countries are so divided? For example, Slovakia and Hungary seem like they don't care and are rather cozying up, for example, with Putin. They're talking about Russia in particular. But it is a good question, isn't it? When you're talking about countries coming together, Thomas, when he just disappeared, was also talking about this feeling that there is more unity within Europe, the wider Europe. But what about these countries where perhaps it isn't quite so clear-cut?
Very good question. Thank you very much for putting it forward. You're absolutely right. It is a challenge, and the question boils, to the fact that if we need to upscale quickly and move fast, indeed, the working principle could be what we call the willing and the capable coalitions of countries who would be the first movers in investing in certain defense capabilities jointly. And Commission, at EU level is putting forward joint procurement programs and projects in defense, in air defenses, and so on. But you're absolutely correct. I think we should not be obsessed with unity, particularly at this very, very dire moment for Europe. I believe that we should be more pragmatic and, come together with those countries who see eye to eye, but who nonetheless are also very important contributors to European security and defense. So I think part of the work could be done at EU level. Another part could be regional coalitions like Joint Expeditionary Force led by the UK and 10 Northern European countries, or perhaps new alliances and coalitions of the willing.
That is a very interesting phrasing right there, and I think it makes a lot of sense. Willing and capable coalitions. I did want to talk about a coalition that exists at the moment, but maybe not in the form that we see it for the future. NATO is a point that Thomas brought up as well, and I did want to ask you, what is the role of NATO here? Where does the NATO role begin and the EU role end, or vice versa? And do you see NATO staying in its current form, given that Friedrich Merz was apprehensive, saying, I don't know if in June the NATO summit will look different to the way NATO summits have looked until now? Talk to us a bit about NATO and all of this.
NATO is the bedrock of European and Euro-Atlantic security. Has always been and will continue to be. NATO is the institution that, in case of war, would be first mobilized. In that respect, what is very essential are the so-called regional plans and defense plans of NATO. We also have a new force model of NATO. Where EU and NATO come into play is that EU is a strong regulatory body. And what is currently being discussed, and we are awaiting the so-called white paper on the future of European defense, is that Europe would mobilize significantly larger funding and financing streams based on the capabilities identified within NATO defense plans.
Okay.
So this way you bring the best of the two worlds, so to say, because NATO does not have regulatory power. It doesn't have the enforcement power. EU does. And the, so to say, synergy and complementarity between the two in that regard would be very important. You're absolutely also correct about what Mertz said. I have always advocated for the fact that we need to always be prepared for the worst case scenario.
Which is the US leaving NATO?
Worst case, sorry?
Which is the US leaving NATO?
It is not, no, I think depending on the US, they could do more harm if they stay. You know, depending on their agenda. But I would not jump into conclusions. I think we need Americans. We need to find a way to entice Americans. We should not be intimidated. We should not be panicking what Trump and his administration is saying. Some of it we deserve, sorry to say that, because for the last 3 years, we've been slow in finding solutions to Ukraine. We have not done enough despite having the capabilities. We did not have enough political will. And now that this is challenged by America, who is, of course, our, so to say, you know, most important partner and ally when it comes to defense, military, and security, suddenly we found ourselves wondering, how can we suddenly come together? Are we able to do that? Can we rely on America or not? Well, the thing is, we should always be ready to better provide for our own defense and security.
Thomas wanted to come in and just make a point.
The worst case scenario is America leaving Europe gradually. Yes, not necessarily NATO, but Europe.
But I think it's the other way around as well. And that's something that I can understand from Maria's point, that Europe has been relying on the United States for too long. But I think it's also important, and I said I lived and I worked as a correspondent in the US, that the US also benefits from European security. It's not only that the US provides security for Europe and doesn't need Europe. The US also benefits from being in NATO. The US also benefits from being in NATO.
What way?
Well, in many ways, that's collective security. We're not here talking only about a specific country that is providing for security. The US benefits from being in an alliance.
So when Donald Trump says there's a beautiful ocean separating Europe and the United States, he's missing a few points. Is that what you're saying?
Well, what I'm saying is that the transatlantic alliance, and when I mean transatlantic alliance, I don't mean just the United States and Europe. I also include Canada, there, is also of interest and of importance to the United States. So sometimes when you hear from European leaders this sort of message that the US is providing everything and that Europe needs to do more, absolutely. But it's also important to understand that the other way around, it also works as well.
Maria, you had a point to make.
I agree with that. And it's a very difficult task to convince the Trump administration of that, because they come from a very different perspective. And I think it's important to try not just judge them, but try to understand where they're coming from. You know, they're coming from with a quite transactional mindset, with very different set of values, different experiences, where history is not really so much on their radar. It's more quick deals, victories, the image. And, you know, they made very clear that Europe is of secondary importance to them.
Correct.
Their primary importance is China. And this also makes Europe very uneasy. But you're absolutely correct. We need to keep enticing America. And this is where European leaders, I think, understood and are coming to their senses and should now create a lot of leverage to show the power that Europe is, because we are. But we are just underestimating it, or not even knowing perhaps our strength. So we need to create a lot of leverage and meet Trump.
I need to jump in again there. I mean, I agree with you, but when you say, for example, that the US is looking to China and that is no longer interested in Europe, that's something that you also heard from previous US administrations. The Obama administration had its pivot to Asia. They were also not particularly interested in the European Union. OK, they did care more about the transatlantic relation, but some of these things that you hear now from the Trump administration are not exclusive to the Trump administration.
Yeah,
you
but
also
the context is important, right? I mean, you were talking about context earlier. This is in the middle of a war that's happening on European soil.
Absolutely. But what I'm trying to say is we've heard some of these things before, so I understand that there's shock in Europe and concern in Europe and that they're thinking, how are we going to be more independent from the United States? But this is not something that just comes from the Trump administration. Part of the discourse that you hear from the Trump administration was that you also heard in the past within other administrations.
It was there in the Obama administration as well, but you never had a Secretary of Defense in his first meeting with NATO at NATO headquarters say that, look, we are going to be more concerned with China and the home front because resources are scarce.
Absolutely. I'm not saying that that the context is not different. What I'm trying to say here is that Europe has had a long time to prepare for this. It's not something that they're just hearing for the very first time.
Cool. Maria, I did want to sort of move it a little forward and talk about Ukraine, because I do not believe we can talk about European defense and not talk about Ukraine. But before I do that, an idea that the leader of Ukraine came up with, and I think this was at the Munich Security Conference, correct me if I'm not wrong, he talked about creating a so-called Army of Europe. What do you make of that idea, given that you just said NATO is the bedrock of European security? Just a comment on that, and then we'll move forward.
Well, like I said, we need to be prepared for worst case scenario. So I don't think this is. I see where he's coming from. In fact, if anyone, it's Ukrainian army who is at the moment the most experienced, the most resilient and resistant army in Europe. And they are keeping the front line. They are shielding us. So in fact, when we are talking, about possible attack, which is now, public information, intelligence and national security authorities have already announced that, within the next 3-5 years, EU and NATO might be attacked militarily by Russia. So Ukraine is absolutely at the heart of it because they are our front line. And learning from them, sharing training with them, sharing best, lessons, best practice experiences, and creating more interoperability in terms of troops and potentially forging them, I think is a great and even overdue idea. Whether that would result in European army, that's another question. But the fact that from the practical point of view, they're the most experienced and our armies could only learn and, count on them is absolutely correct. And we should only welcome such propositions from Ukraine.
I remember when Josep Borrell was still in office, he used to bristle at the whole mention of European army. He hated the term and he was at pains to explain that that is not what he's talking about. But yeah, I just always remember his facial expression whenever the term European army came up. Just want to sort of throw that there. But Alex.
Yeah, I just want to very briefly just mention a few comments from our chat, which is still very lively. William Sandberg says, talking about whether NATO can still exist without the US, we all have to understand that without the United States, we are still 52 countries in NATO. That is still massive power. Is it really that many? Is it 52?
I don't think it's 52.
No, but anyway, it's still a lot of countries, even without the US. He says, Raskiel says, the United States isn't saying spend... 32, thank you. Well done, good checking. Yeah, love it.
Live fact-checking.
Raskela says the United States isn't saying spend more and protect yourself. It's saying spend more, therefore buy more weapons from me and help my economy. So just a few of those comments as we're talking about NATO and what the outlook could look like if the worst happens and the United States does decide to pull out. But I don't think we think it is, do we?
I don't know. Can I share my personal views? Maybe we do that later. But let's talk about Ukraine, because we're talking about European defense. How can we not talk about Ukraine? Maria, do you think Ukraine is a test case for how Europe deals with defense questions and security questions of the future?
I mean, I don't disagree with that. I mean, true, if we can't prove that we take care of what, to put it very simply, if Europe can't manage to take care of its own garden, indeed, it puts into question, would Europe be able to deal if something emerges, in Poland or the Baltic states, or if we are tested in other ways by Russia. So yes, it tested our willingness, it tested our readiness, it tested our preparedness, it tested our emotions and fears, if I can put it this way. And we learned a lot of lessons. I mean, this is why now we have Commissioner for Defence and Space, in fact. This is why we are creating European Defence Industrial Technological Base. This is why we are discussing, worst case scenarios. This is further reinforced by relative uncertainty whether we can rely on US or not, or perhaps under what conditions. And of course, what makes us very nervous is Russia and possible ceasefire. So indeed, it would. It exposes us a lot and shows where our gaps are and how willing or unwilling, our limits, so to say, in what we could and would or wouldn't do.
I just wanted to sort of play an exchange between Donald Trump and Emmanuel Macron. Emmanuel Macron was at the start of the week in DC at the White House talking to Donald Trump. And the reason I would like to play this is because I wonder if this is a model for the way Europeans should be working with the United States when it comes to the question of defense. Let's just play that soundbite. I think you might know what I'm talking about. Let's play that and we'll come and ask your views on it.
Europe is loaning the money to Ukraine. They get their money back.
No, in fact, to be frank, we paid 60% of the total efforts, and it was through, like the US, loans, guarantee, grants, and we provided real money. To be clear, we have 230 billion frozen assets in Europe, Russian assets, but this is not as a collateral of a loan because this is not our belonging. So they are frozen. If at the end of the day, in the negotiation we will have with Russia, they're ready to give it to us, super. It will be loan at the end of the day, and Russia will have paid for that.
If you believe that, it's okay with me.
Maria, is that a template for how Europe should be dealing with the United States on questions of defense and handling disagreements?
In some respects, you could say, especially, about the style and tone, because it's important, not to approach Trump, regardless of your own, thoughts about him and his approaches, not to be judgmental, not to be confrontational, but, in a very light way, to correct certain information, to put forward what the facts are and to stand by those facts. But it just shows to me how important it is to engage with him, and he seems to be open to engaging. Mm-hmm. So I think more leaders should, engage with Trump, and especially not just one by one, but collectively. And that doesn't mean EU27. It could be, for example, Nordics and Baltics going together as a club. It could be the UK, going on its own, but perhaps at some point all going together and highlighting, areas where Europe has leverage that can help Americans push the Russians, where we have leverage when it comes to China, where what we can give America, because now it's very important not just to ask ourselves what America can do for us, but what we could do to America, and Trump specifically, actually, because he's very much, interested in deals and having this victories and winning scenario, quick win scenarios, quick fix scenarios, so to say. So I commend Macron, with his style and approach that he went there. He just debriefed also the European leaders.
Macron showing the way. Who wants to go first, Thomas or Alex?
It's the same thing with. I want to say something about the hands as well.
The hand on his
Yes.
arm. That it was so tactile, wasn't it? That's what really
that's part of the strategy. That's part of the strategy on how to deal with Trump, because there's an understanding that a way in which you can deal with Trump is by focusing on the personal level. From the UK, for example, in the current government, there was the idea that you should have the sort of Gulf diplomacy effect, which was basically based on Shinzo Abe, the former Japanese prime minister, who used to play golf with Donald Trump during his first term and managed to influence Trump also politically in several ways. And that was the idea that now Keir Starmer, when he goes to DC, should also try and have a discussion at a personal eye-to-eye level with Donald Trump and then foster that dialogue. And not only Keir Starmer, within the European Union, there was the idea that, for example, Giorgia Meloni, the leader in Italy, who has very close relationship also to the US government, should be one of the leaders from the European bloc leading that kind of personal link towards the Trump administration. So that's one element which I think will be very important also in the next few years. Through the personal element, get to the sort of difficult issues. For example, the topic that we're talking about today, the issue of collective defense.
And how many EU leaders play golf?
I don't know. Keir Starmer doesn't. Well, he's not an EU leader, but he doesn't play golf. I don't know which other leaders play. I don't know if Friedrich Merz plays golf.
He flies a plane. He has a private plane.
He flies.
He flies. He has his own plane.
He does.
So maybe that works.
Can I just pick up on Casper Christensen asked this question, which I'd love to get an answer. Ukraine. Very important point this. Ukraine gave up their nuke, so their nuclear defence, in exchange for UK and US security. Is it worth nothing? Are they not allowed to acquire nuclear weapons now? A question then coming up because of the fact that that was the deal that Ukraine had made to give up their nuclear defence. Well, how many years ago? Oh, quite some years ago, and now 1994, and now obviously the feeling is, are they now being sold out? That everything that they've done is worth nothing.
Of course, they are, and you know we haven't even invested in their victory enough. We could have had breakthrough victory, but we haven't had it over the past 3 years. You're absolutely correct. I mean, it's just terrible that one of the signatories invaded the country, another one is now, there's lack of clarity about where US stands vis-a-vis Ukraine, or at least, it's not that clear anymore, so to say. And the third country indeed has, in terms of UK, has shown leadership, is showing support, and is in fact itself a nuclear country. And I think this is also why Britain is so eager to come in and was the first country to raise the idea of possibly sending troops to Ukraine. I think it's that responsibility. But also UK has always, been a very invested European player. So absolutely. And I would link this to the broader security guarantees discussion, because having nuclear protection could be part of the security guarantees. Nothing should be excluded from the table.
I'm glad you said that, Maria. I'm sorry to interrupt you. It's just because last week we had Kira Rudik, an MP from the Ukrainian Holos Party, it's an opposition libertarian liberal party, on the show, and I asked her directly if the best security guarantee that Ukraine can have is to go nuclear, and she said yes. That's the only security guarantee that would work in Ukraine's favor. What do you say to that thought? I see security guarantees slightly, perhaps differently. The best security guarantee is for Ukraine and Europe is victory against the aggressor. That is, I think, number one. And I think that should be our bar when we meet Trump, because he also, starts very, very high initially. Second, of course, nuclear, absolutely. It would provide the necessary deterrent, but also we could explore other military alliances. NATO won, but okay, there is, lack of clarity also with NATO, yet I think that should not be brushed off the table just because Trump administration says so. It should be explored by the Europeans in their conversations with Trump. Just because they say something doesn't mean it cannot be pursued or pushed back. We need to stand up for ourselves and for what we believe as Europeans as well, because we do have leverage. Third, it could be other alliances, for example, joint expeditionary force led by the UK with 10 Northern Europeans. This is a potential grouping, because what Russia fears the most is for Ukraine to belong to any capable military alliance.
And then, it could also boil down to the fact that if we train more Ukrainian armed forces, if we provide them, with strategic enablers, if we provide them with more weapons and make them as strong as possible, that is also, helping to guaranteeing their security.
Okay, we'll leave that discussion there for the moment. Maria Martisiute from the European Policy Center, thanks so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure listening to you. I hope we can have you back on. And I'm pretty certain that we will, given the way geopolitics is moving in the world right now. Thanks for sparing your time. It's been a pleasure chatting with you. Thanks so much. Let's chat again some other time.
Thank you for having me.
Well, that was Maria. Thomas, let's just try and wrap this up. How do you see things going in Ukraine? Europeans are not at the table at the moment, but Europe will have to be at the table at some point if any security guarantee or if the war in Ukraine has to end, right?
Absolutely. There's no doubt about that. Europe has to be at the table. The question is how and under what specific circumstances. The goal is not to have any kind of peace deal. The goal is to have a peace deal that benefits all parties and a deal that, above all, respects international law. Because the concern that many in Europe have, especially the concern that many European leaders have, is that, for example, if borders remain now as they are, with Russia controlling around 20% of Ukraine's territory, then that would set a terrible precedent for the future, because it would really change the way or the understanding about international law. So that's one element. But I would like to also end with a little bit more of a positive note, because...
Yeah, do that, because we've been talking about nuclear weapons. And
this is all a bit gloomy and difficult, and I don't want to... I mean, it is gloomy and it is difficult, and there are a lot of challenges, but this could also be an opportunity for Europe. If Europe understands this correctly, if Europe in the next few years really builds up its defense, if Europe in the next few years does manage to become a little bit more independent from the United States without being totally independent, because I don't think that no one really wants that in Europe.
Although Friedrich Merz used the word independence from the US, but...
Yes, but I think with independence, maybe he doesn't mean leaving the US completely aside.
Or decoupling.
Yes, exactly. Then I think when Trump's time in office ends, then Europe will be better prepared to deal with all the challenges that Maria was just mentioning, also from Brussels.
That is a positive take on it. Thanks for that, Thomas.
And Jonathan Guerrero in the chat says what the US and Russia fears is a strong and united Europe. So picking up on that very point.
Maria was also alluding to. We need to come to you, Cherry. Cherry in the chat. I think some people like that term. We're going to use it. Whenever Cherry's on, we're going to say Cherry in the chat. You've closed the poll?
Yeah, I just closed the poll, yeah. Thank you, everyone, for voting. We've got 592 votes. Let me repeat the question again. What single thing would make Europe more secure? Many people went for the option of creating a European army. 42% of people voted for that. 21% says massive expansion of arms industry. 20% says forming non-US alliances, and 15% goes to building its nuclear deterrence.
Those are very interesting results. Creating a European army. I mean, Maria was talking about that at length. I mean, she wasn't so hot on the idea because it is not a simple thing to implement, right? I mean, a Europe-wide army.
It was certainly something that the UK didn't want.
Yes,
at the time,
that's something that the UK didn't want. And those who fear, and I know we're short of time, but those who fear that European Union expansion into territory that is normally something for nation states, they don't want a European army. I don't see this really happening in the near future. Again, because it's something that, above all, is a matter for individual states.
But also given that we also have NATO as a bedrock of European security, as Maria said. Thomas, thanks so much for being on the program. Thanks for being patient. And thanks for the points that you brought in.
It's a pleasure.
Jared, we loved hearing from you. That was great context that you brought in over there. And a live fact check as well. Cherry, thanks for being in the chat. Cherry in the chat.
Cherry in the chat.
We're going to love this and we look forward to this.
It's going to be my name from now on.
Thanks to all of you for sending in your comments and your questions and observations. We try and bring in as many as we can.
There are so many.
There are so many. It's a subject that has very many views. I hope you don't grudge it if we cannot bring in everything, but we try and do our best. And Alex, thank you for doing that.
Yeah, and hello, Carolina. I didn't read one of your comments, but thank you for all your comments as well. Thank you to everyone. Just a reminder that we will post next week's news topic on the YouTube community page around about 24 hours beforehand. So do stay tuned to that, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
And who knows, we'll be talking about Ukraine again, the way things are going.
Possibly.
We don't know. Thanks so much for joining us. Thanks, Alex. It's been a pleasure. See you guys.
Bye.